Hello everyone, good to see you all. Looking forward to catching up over supper, which we always have after our service. A nativity sermon, because don't we all love a nativity? Love a good nativity scene? You see less of these, I think, these days on people's lawns and on Christmas cards and at shopping centres, but you occasionally come across one. It's a stable, under the bright shining star, the baby in the manger, with his smiling parents looking on, the three wise men arriving with camels, with gifts for the baby. Usually there's some shepherds there too, kneeling in the hay, and the angels are singing above. And if you know the Gospels well, you'll know that these elements come from a combination of Luke's Gospel story about Jesus' birth and Matthew's Gospel story about Jesus' birth. Mark's Gospel doesn't really have a nativity scene, and John's Gospel doesn't really tell a story. He just talks about light coming into the world and the Word becoming flesh and dwelling amongst us. But did you know there's another nativity scene in the Bible that's not quite so well known? You rarely hear about it, and it doesn't seem to make its way into our Christmas lawn decorations. And yet, it is perhaps the most pertinent, the most relevant, the most important nativity scene for our times. So we're going to hear that now. Maybe.
Tonight's Bible reading comes from the book of Revelation, chapter 12. I've got 1 to 6. Then a great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun and with the moon under her feet, and on her head was a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was screaming with labour pains, struggling to give birth. Then another sign appeared in heaven, a huge red dragon that had 7 heads and 10 horns, and on its heads were 7 diadem crowns. Now the dragon's tail swept away a third of the stars in heaven and hurled them to the earth. Then the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that he might devour her child as soon as it was born. So the woman gave birth to a son, a male child, who is going to shepherd the nations with an iron staff. Her child was suddenly caught up to God and to his throne, and she fled into the wilderness, where a place had been prepared for her by God, so she could be taken care of for 1,260 days.
And there's our next nativity scene. I'm trying to picture this nativity scene on the lawn at somebody's house. There's this pregnant woman lying with her legs apart. She's screaming in pain, and there's a 7-headed dragon with 10 horns, and it's just salivating right in front of her, waiting to devour the baby as soon as it appears. I actually went to Christmas Shack this year. Got a new Christmas tree, but also was looking for this particular nativity scene. Couldn't find it anywhere. When I inquired, I just got blank, somewhat nervous looks. It's a weird story, isn't it? I did a series on Revelation last year. It doesn't seem that long ago, but it was like a year and a half ago. And we found out that Revelation was never intended to be a book that predicted future times and dates and events. Rather, it's a heavenly perspective on the events that are happening on earth at and before the time of John, who was the author of Revelation. A perspective that even though it's kind of grounded in a time and place, 1st century Roman Empire, it's a perspective that's relevant to all times everywhere. Much of Revelation is a description of a series of visions given to John, who has been transported away from the Isle of Patmos, where he was writing from, and he gets transported in this vision up into the heavenly realms. And when he gets to the heavenly realm, it's a little bit like the Situation Room underneath the White House in the series West Wing, which I've just started again. Love that show. And I've already seen it, the Situation Room. It's got this giant table in the middle, and that's where the president and his intelligence and defence chiefs all sit, and they sit around the table and they discuss what's happening. They discuss what to do about unfolding situations that are happening on the ground around the world. And so they're there. In Revelation, of course, it's a big throne instead of a large table, but nonetheless, it's a similar concept. And the Situation Room is lined with TV screens that live stream the helicopter rescue or the hunt for the bad guys or whatever it is that's happening down there. And so the president and his cohort can both see what's happening on the ground, wherever it is, and they can also direct what's happening on the ground. And so here's John in the Situation Room that he finds himself in this vision, and he's able to see what's happening in that Situation Room, but he can also see the screens that show the corresponding actions that's happening on the ground. So that's what we've got in Revelation. That's kind of how Revelation works. So Luke and Matthew, their Gospels, they tell us the story of the first Christmas as it's happening on the ground, right? From the perspective of Bethlehem. What we've got here in Revelation is the nativity scene as seen from God's heavenly Situation Room. And there's a dragon in it. The people down there don't see the dragon, but there's an evil dragon looming over the scene as the baby is born. The other thing we found out in that series on Revelation is that Revelation doesn't really tell a story in a linear sequence. It doesn't start with what happened first and then what happened next and then what happened after that. It's less a story and it's more like an art gallery with pictures on the walls. And each of the visions in Revelation, and they're all pretty weird, each vision kind of functions like a painting. And you can wander around that art gallery and just sort of gaze into the painting and look at it and notice what's in there. Maybe even notice how it's connected to the other paintings in the room. And you can notice different aspects of John's artwork. So we could call Revelation 12, the passage that Deb read to us, as a painting of the nativity scene as it's seen from this heavenly Situation Room. Well, why is there a dragon in it? Well, let's delve a little bit deeper. And if you've been at MCC for a while, you'll recognise these phrases: behind the text, in front of the text. And I just want to acknowledge Eugene Boring's commentary on Revelation, which is where I got some of this information. So what's happening behind the text? What's happening? What's the cultural, historical background of this wacky vision? Not far from where John was writing, on the Isle of Patmos, there's another island, and it's called the island of Delos. It's a place sacred to the Greeks because in a story known to all of John's readers from childhood, they know this story well, it was there that the god Apollo, the son of the great god Zeus, was born. In one version of the story, Apollo's mother, Leto, actually I'm not quite sure how to pronounce that. Does anyone into Greek mythology? Yes. Leto, thank you, Grace. Okay, so Apollo's mother Leto had fled to this island to escape the dragon Python. Isn't that a weird name for a dragon, Python? In the ancient world and in ancient myths, serpents and dragons, they're pretty much the same thing. And hence we've got a dragon whose name is Python. So this fearsome dragon wants to kill the newborn baby, Apollos, because he was the son of Zeus, and he didn't like Zeus. Instead of being killed, Apollos kills the dragon. And then he becomes this sort of like first divine king on the earth. And he then reigned over a golden age of peace and prosperity. So this mythical tale, this Greek mythology, it's a classic story of how the forces of darkness and disorder and death rebelled against the forces of light and order and life, but were ultimately defeated. And, you know, there's lots of these kinds of stories in ancient mythology in various cultures that illustrate the cosmic conflict between good and evil. Well, the Roman emperors, they found this Greek myth quite politically useful. Here's what they did with it. Whoops. They inserted their own caste into the myth. Leto, the pregnant woman, well, she's actually the goddess Roma, the queen of heaven who personified Rome. The emperors, well, they cast themselves as the son of Roma because they're able to defeat the forces of darkness just like he was. So when Augustus became the first emperor of Rome, he talked about his own rule in terms of this myth. And he claimed that his administration would be a golden age of peace and prosperity, and that he was, in fact, the new Apollos. A few decades later, Emperor Nero had statues of himself made that looked just like the god Apollo. As I've said, very politically useful. As an ordinary citizen in a powerful and often violent empire, it's pretty hard to protest against a divinely appointed emperor, isn't it? Well, enter John and the book of Revelation. In chapter 12 and 13, John's descriptions of the visions that he had, they sound a lot like this myth, don't they? But what John does is he recasts it again. So we've got the woman who gives birth to a divine child. Does that sound familiar to you? This is Mary. Her child is saved by divine intervention. If you can remember Matthew's story, the wicked King Herod wants to kill the child, and they escape by fleeing to the wilderness. If you remember back to the reading. If you gaze long enough at this picture in the art gallery that's Revelation, you can see shadows of other women sitting behind Mother Mary. Does it remind you at all of Eve in the garden in Genesis, the Garden of Eden, the queen mother of all God's children, whose seed or offspring, what are they going to do? They're going to crush the head of the serpent dragon, and the serpent will bite the heel of the offspring. Look a little bit longer into this painting. You may also see ancient Israel fleeing into the wilderness to escape Egypt's evil Pharaoh with his cobra headdress. It's the story of the Exodus. And of course, it's ancient Israel who eventually gives birth to a Messiah. What about John's time? Well, in John's time, after the resurrection and the ascension, when Jesus is caught up to God and to his throne, just coming back to that passage in Revelation again, the woman who flees into the wilderness correlates to the early Christians who fled to safety when the Roman army came to destroy Jerusalem in 70 CE. And that's an event that's still very fresh in the minds of John's readers because it happened just 20 years or so before he wrote. You see, there are images overlaying images. It's like those pictures that, you know, when you first look at them, you see one thing and then you sort of change your focal length just a little bit and another image appears. That's how Revelation works. It works by piling up images from different stories so that all the stories end up kind of interconnected and they start to shed light on each other. They start to interpret each other. Instead of Rome and its emperors being the hero of this story, of John's vision, John casts them as the dragon, or at least aligned with the dragon, the forces of darkness. Instead of killing the serpent dragon, the Roman Empire does the dragon's bidding by trying to kill Apollos. And of course, in John's vision, who was that? But the Messiah, Jesus. And as soon as we hear that, we've got those flashes of Herod again, killing all the baby boys. But flashes too of the cross, where the Roman Empire did its utmost to murder the Messiah. In both cases, though, they failed. The baby boy escaped with his parents as they fled to Egypt, and the adult Messiah died on a cross only to be resurrected and taken up to heaven, where he rules with God. Again, the images of serpent dragons pile up on top of one another, suggesting that the forces of evil have always been with us. They've been with us since the very beginning. In various iterations, all throughout history. But they are no match for God, and they are no match for God's Messiah, who will ultimately defeat them. Well, all this is very interesting. And maybe it gives a little bit more clarity to this book that we've all struggled with over the years. But what does it really matter? Is there something for us to ponder in Revelation 12, apart from it being kind of interesting to know the background of some of this? Because we don't really have to worry about an Italian army coming for us, do we? Well, the nativity scene offered hope to John's first readers. They lived in a world of tremendous political volatility. And John was saying, you know, the forces of darkness will not prevail. Whatever our situation is, whatever darkness we're facing, whatever the darkness the world is facing, there is hope. This nativity scene is an antidote to despair. What we see around us is not the whole truth. All is not as it seems. God sits on the throne and the dragon has been defeated. There's also a warning. The characters in the story of this cosmic battle between good and evil, they can be cast in different ways. The Roman Empire cast them in a different way than the original Greek myth. And then John casts the characters in a different way again. Be careful who you cast as your saviour. Be careful who or what you give your allegiance to, who you bow down and worship. We should be wary and suspicious of anyone or anything that declares itself to be the saviour of the world, whether that's a politician or a political party of any persuasion, whether it's an investment scheme that's going to make you rich, or an economic theory that promises wealth, a religious leader, including me, or theology that guarantees to fix you and solve all of your problems, a pharmaceutical company, or a drug that promises salvation, cosmetic surgery, a Mediterranean diet, high-intensity interval training. You know, whatever it is that you think could be your salvation, I'm saying it isn't. I'm also saying, don't misunderstand me, all of these things could be really helpful for life. Some may be necessary for good health. We may find them to be a very wise course of action, because I've just read all about high-intensity interval training, and I'm there. But, you know, just be careful about putting them on a pedestal and trusting them as your saviour. There's only one of them. There's also a way. The book of Revelation reminded its first readers that there's a different way to view the world. And if we view the world differently, we end up living differently in it. Revelation opens our eyes to see that there really is a dragon. There are forces of darkness in the world that impact the lives of people. You just need to read the news to work that one out. And I'm not alluding to some grand conspiracy theory of 7 powerful people who worship Satan and have a detailed plan to take over the world. I'm talking about human nature and what happens when you put a group of people together who have different levels of power and differing levels of desire and resources at their disposal, who want different things. I'm talking about how we work really hard to protect ourselves against others, how our group works to protect ourselves against other groups, how we scapegoat others to avoid taking responsibility, to avoid being scapegoated ourselves, how our need for belonging and significance drives us into doing things that might harm other people, whether intentionally or unintentionally, even when those things that we do might go against our own personal values. There really is a dragon. But there's also a dragon slayer. And Revelation encourages us to give our allegiance to the dragon slayer, to slay the dragon alongside him. But instead of fighting fire with fire, to follow the lead of the dragon slayer and to learn from the dragon slayer how you can actually slay a dragon. Next year, I've mentioned already, it's going to be a big year. Remember that? It's going to be a big year. We're going to be looking at the way of Jesus, looking at one of Jesus' teachings each month, and we're going to be practicing them. Think of that as training to slay a dragon. I'll let you move that on, Shane. There is a video which we're having trouble playing, but I'm going to put it into Slack. So those of you who are on Slack, I might even put it in the newsletter. Have a look at that video. It's worthwhile.